Hi, everyone. Welcome to Ordinary People Changing Systems, Willowbrook, a retrospective on systems change. I'm Cassandra Evans, Assistant Professor of Disability Studies at CUNY School of Professional Studies. We're going to go ahead and get started because I know this is a big program and there are a lot of you here. Thank you all so much for being here. We're going to have captioners and closed captioning, so that will be going on. I'm going to be trying to speak a little slowly for those who need captioning. And I want to welcome you all here. This is a really important month. As you know, it's Disability Awareness Month in March. This is one in a two-part series that we're going to be doing. Our second part will be April 12th, and that will be systems change through court-ordered reform. I'll be reminding you about that again at the end of the session. So thank you also to our campus, to our events coordinators, Heather Zaman, Ju-Wan Choi, our Dean of Academics, Dr. George Audi, and Interim Campus Dean, Jorge Silva Puras, for sponsoring this. In a moment, I'm going to introduce to you Dr. Mark Friedman, who's also a faculty member here in our department, and he'll be sharing with you his work and knowledge and privilege of time with Dr. Mariette Bates before she speaks. I'll just tell you before we get going a little bit about our programs. We at SPS have number of certificates in disability studies and disability services in higher education. We have a bachelor's degree, the first in the nation, thanks to Dr. Bates, and a master's degree in disability studies, as well as a master's in disability services for higher education. We also, again, thanks to Dr. Bates, have the Journal of Teaching Disability Studies, a number of lectures and public events, and students and faculty from around the globe. So I feel so honored to be here, and I will be leading you through this. At the end of our discussion, I will be fielding your comments and questions throughout. So go ahead and write those in the chat, and I will take as many as I possibly can. Let me know who you are, where you're from, and we will get to those probably maybe 6:40-ish when Mariette is done with her talk, 6:45. But go ahead and put them in and I will be compiling them as we go. So I'm now going to tell you a little bit about Dr. Friedman, who is also faculty, as I mentioned. And thank you again. We have so many supporters here. I keep seeing these names. This is one of our biggest events, so I'm really excited. So Dr. Friedman teaches disability studies here as an adjunct associate professor at CUNY and primarily in our department. His work has been primarily with helping people with disabilities to gain a voice in their lives through self-advocacy and policy making. He's also worked to help people move from large state institutions into community programs. He's currently training Michigan boards of directors to include people with disabilities. For the Nebraska Department of Health and Human Services, he's conducting online training for 4,500 service coordinators, families, people with disabilities, and professionals in person-centered planning. Dr. Friedman was a subject matter expert on participant engagement to the North Dakota Department of Human Services and the Alabama Department of Mental Health, funded by the Administration on Community Living and the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid. Dr. Friedman's most recent work on employment was extensively cited by the National Commission on Civil Rights. He received his PhD degree from the Union Institute and University. He's presented to audiences in 22 states, provided advocacy training in Ecuador and Kosovo, and authored 13 publications. His work was recently highlighted in the New York Times, which you could see, we can put that in the chat as well. So without further pause, I will give you to Dr. Friedman. Enjoy the presentation. And again, I will be compiling your comments and questions for Dr. Bates. Thank you so much for being here.
Cassandra, I really appreciate that. Well, I am honored to be able to introduce my colleague and friend. I first met Mariette, I'm going to refer to her as Mariette, as my friend, 40 years ago, which is an amazing thing to think about. She was the program director and project director of training for One-to-One. One-to-One at the time was one of the premier advocacy groups around Willowbrook. It was formed by Geraldo Rivera, who had this incredible exposé in '72. And following that, he helped to found One-to-One. Marriott was a program director there. I've been working on a similar institution in Pennsylvania called Pennhurst, so we had much in common when we first met. I remember coming from Philadelphia to New York to meet people at One-to-One and meeting her. I noticed immediately Mariette was one of those quiet leaders. She was one of the people who's always in the background doing the work. The people that do the real work, aren't the ones who are getting their names in the paper, but she was inspiring people to be their best selves. And Mariette's had a long history of inspiring people. Long ago, before in Disabilities, Mariette co-founded a bookstore in New Hampshire. She was a singer and had a band. Later, Mariette and her partner, Duncan Whiteside, founded Maidstone Foundation, which helps specifically people with the most significant disabilities and people without a voice. They especially worked with people who were Russian immigrants, families who had people with disabilities who had come from Russia. Mariette began teaching at CUNY when there was no such thing as disability studies. And over the last 10 years more, she developed what we now call disability studies from a tiny spark, a tiny idea, in one of the best 3 programs in the United States, serving over 300 people each semester. Mariette's work has been noted in New York Times for the Disability Studies program. Mariette's worked and imparted work training and effort with people across the United States and around the world. In 2003, I had the great honor to go with Mariette and her partner Duncan Whiteside to Ecuador to provide training to families and people with disabilities. And Mariette's work has had an impact on people not only in the United States, but around the world. With CUNY, we have people from all over the country and in fact, all over the world. When Mariette started her work 40 years ago, there were 200,000 people living in Willowbrook type state institutions all over the country. Today, there's fewer than 20,000. And almost all of those people moved into small community homes. Mariette inspired through her work thousands of ordinary people to put their shoulders to the wheel to make these revolutionary changes. And indeed, it was a revolutionary. And today we have fewer people in institutions than ever before. I believe the deinstitutionalization of people with intellectual and developmental disabilities is one of the most significant social changes in the United States history, and it's being repeated around the world as we speak. Mariette was a foot soldier in this movement. She was a quiet leader, but more importantly, she was an inspirational leader. Mariette's won many awards. I think her biggest legacy will be the Disability Studies program, which I think eventually will be regarded as the Harvard of Disability Studies. I'm proud to call Mariette my friend, and Mariette, we're on. Thank you.
Okay. Hi, everybody. I'm so glad to see you all tonight, and thank you for coming. As my colleague David Good pointed out, there are many Willowbrooks, as many as those who were affected by it. The name conjures up many images, mostly horrific ones. But I didn't want my time here with you tonight to be all about dehumanization, abuse, and neglect, but rather to talk about the attitudes and changes in attitudes and care that have evolved since those pictures appeared on our television screens and shocked the conscience of the city and the country 50 years ago. In this presentation, I tend to use people first language because this is about folks with intellectual and developmental disabilities, and in general, that's how they preferred to be addressed. For young people, all this fuss about Willowbrook must seem like ancient history. I often think for many of our students who are younger, that old video from 1972 of Geraldo's expose must be like my seeing newsreels from World War II, that they're emotionally affecting, but distant. So I will talk about Willowbrook tonight, but But I also really want to introduce you to people you may not know about who changed the service system. I entitled this talk, Ordinary People Changing Systems, because the people involved who were just that, ordinary people like you or me, who found themselves in very unusual circumstances. Some were people who were placed in Willowbrook who survived its abuse and lived to talk about it and to witness what went on there. Some were parents who never expected to be called upon to lead. Some were students who were called to help, and some were professionals who wanted to be involved in something new and exciting. If you subscribe to the idea that revolutions in thought happen when innovative thinking, often seen as very outlandish ideas, become mainstream over time, the 50 years since Willowbrook shows a lot of evidence of that. But I also want to acknowledge the system that we have after Willowbrook is far from perfect. It isn't what we envisioned 50 years ago. Human service systems serve people by relying on other people, and we all have good days and bad days. Some people are driven to help others, some are incompetent, and some are cruel. Our system's largely the result of dependence on the funding and associated regulations, and the best designed systems tend toward entropy over time. So I want to start tonight by looking at the post-war service system, that is, what existed for people before this cataclysm of Willowbrook took place. So first of all, if you had a child with an intellectual or developmental disability, you had very limited access to doctors who knew anything about how to help your son or your daughter, or could tell you anything about their future. My stepson was in Willowbrook, he's 57 now, and when he was born in 1964, my husband and Michael's mother went to the doctor to see what the doctor might be able to tell them about Michael. And he was looked at by the doctor, and then of course they went in for the big consultation where they got this information about him. And the doctor looked at him and said, you know, my husband and his wife, and said, "I've never seen a kid like that before. Do you mind if I take some pictures?" And that was the diagnosis that they got: multiple congenital anomalies. So the doctors told them that Michael would never sit up, smile, roll over, or anything, have any physical ability to move. And of course, within 6 months, he was doing all of the things that the doctor said he wouldn't do. I've heard that story again and again and again in the hundreds of parents that I've talked to in the last 50 years. So that it wasn't unusual. And I would say that we've made some progress in that area, but maybe not enough. There were also very few dentists who would treat children, particularly if they needed anesthesia to get their teeth cleaned and work done. There were no early intervention programs or special education programs, special ed preschool that we have now. No right to attend public school. Children could go to school from about the age of 7 to 16 if the school would accept them. But it wasn't a codified right. And in fact, many children didn't go to school. There was no in-home support or respite for families, kinds of services that we have now. So if you had a child with a disability and you were keeping that child at home, you were there with that child all the time, unless you had extended family who could help you, which many people did. There were limited recreational programs, and those programs were started by parents who were banded together with other parents to try and engage in some voluntary activity to try to provide some recreation for children. There were no residential options for adults. In 1972, here in New York City, there was one community residence that was started by AHRC. And there was limited access to vocational kinds of activities. In many counties, there was a sheltered workshop. If your child, your adult child fit that profile, you could have access to that workshop. But other than that, there was no services. And the techniques to teach the kind of skills that people needed to learn in order to be more independent and to have more interesting lives were just being developed. So with nothing available to families, families turned to themselves to try and create systems. So I want to acknowledge that before Willowbrook happened, there were people who were getting together to try and provide some services. And I used as a surrogate here, Ann Greenberg. This was an article she put in the New York Post in 1949. And I will use the word retarded here because that appears in the Post article. I certainly wouldn't use that language today. And she said, to mothers of retarded children ages 4 to 8, are you interested in helping to start a day nursery for your children? So from that Post advertisement, she had 20 people banded together. Within about 2 years, I think 200 families had found this young woman and her son. And now that early effort has turned into an agency in New York called the HRC, which serves thousands and thousands and thousands of people. So, but there were other instances of parents banding together. And again, there was no funding for this kind of program. So there were little recreation programs, a day nursery like that, but really nothing for families other than that. So if you were a family that had money and was wealthy, you could find a residential school for your child, and you could put your child in a pretty nice place in Pennsylvania or upstate New York. But for many families, the choice was to keep your child at home and essentially hope that services might appear, or as your doctor and your clergyman and your family told you, you might put your child in an institution like Willowbrook, where you were essentially told this is where your child was going to get the help that they needed because they had specialized staff. So those were the choices available, and that's how so many people ended up in Willowbrook State School. So I'm going to give you a trigger warning now about Willowbrook. I'm going to show you 3 pictures of Willowbrook, not more than that. This is the kind of iconic picture of Willowbrook, and it's a brick building with 6 stories and a central tower. It's built along the lines of many hospitals that were built along in the 1930s. So Willowbrook State School, you can find this in many publications about Willowbrook, was authorized in 1938, and it was really authorized to create programs for people around New York City because the nearest institution, which was Letchworth Village, upstate in Rockland County, was overcrowded. So building construction started in 1938. It was originally envisioned to house 3,000 people, and then the war intervened. So it became a veterans hospital. And here is Halloran General Hospital in Staten Island. This is a kind of a postcard that shows you what Willowbrook, this iconic picture of Willowbrook State School. After the war, around the time Ann Greenberg was starting her day nursery for children, the first infants were accepted at Willowbrook as the veterans moved out. So there were 2 infants that were accepted in 1948. By 1952, when Willowbrook formally opened, it was already overcrowded. By 1963, there were over 6,000 people living there. So it was double the capacity that it was planned for, to be there. So as you might imagine, conditions weren't so terrific. There were epidemics of parasites, hepatitis. As a matter of fact, there was hepatitis was so rampant that some doctors were engaged to create the hepatitis vaccine using the residents of Willowbrook against the Nuremberg Code and any medical ethics that we might now recognize. And you can read about the hepatitis B, the Willowbrook hepatitis B experiments. There's a literature out there about that. So 1963, there's 6,000 people there. Robert Kennedy, who's running for Senate, visits Willowbrook in 1965 and calls it a snake pit. The population got somewhat reduced after that. There were new buildings that were built for children. And so in 1971, there's 5,300 people in Willowbrook. And so it's 65% over capacity at that point. And to make matters worse, there was a hiring freeze because we had a fiscal crisis in New York City. And so if people left Willowbrook, they weren't replaced. So a situation that was already bad because of the conditions there, where you might have one staff person taking care of maybe 14 people, they ended up essentially with one person taking care of maybe 60 people. And those people were largely dependent on their caregiver for food, for toileting, and to try and keep order. So it was an untenable situation, not only for the people who were living there, of course, but also for the workers who were asked to do a remarkable job. Some of them were frustrated, some of them were abusive. Many of them were really, really trying to do what they could, given this completely untenable situation that they found themselves in. So along come two doctors, Bill Bronston and Mike Wilkins, and they came to serve people in Willowbrook, the people most in need. And so Dr. Bronston had been to programs in Sweden and in California, where they had a different view of how to care for people with intellectual disabilities. That acknowledged their humanity, that saw them as people, that realized that they couldn't really fully learn the skills that they needed to have a successful and fulfilling life unless they were given the same opportunities as other citizens were. And he tried to bring those ideas to Willowbrook State School, but people were so conditioned to the conditions that were there, and so locked into their way of thinking that he wasn't successful in changing the system. Instead, he was successful in making the administration hostile to those ideas. But he did manage to enlist some professionals who also really thought that there could be a different philosophy of care. And particularly, he helped to organize the parents who started to realize that their children were in danger in this institution because of the overcrowding and because of the horrific kinds of situations they found themselves in. So in 1971, the Staten Island Advance, a reporter named Jane Curtin, started to do stories about the conditions at Willowbrook. And because Dr. Wilkins talked to the press, as did Bernard Carabello, one of the famous residents of Willowbrook, who was a very articulate person who'd grown up there. There was a series of articles in the Staten Island Advance and about the horrific conditions in Willowbrook. And that, of course, got the attention of the administration of the institution. So on January 5th, Dr. Wilkins got fired, as did Elizabeth Lee, a famous social worker who was there, who also believed in a more humane kinds of care. And on January 6th, Geraldo showed up with his cameras and put the conditions at Willowbrook on local television and then on national television, and created this cataclysm. So here's some pictures of Willowbrook. Here's one picture of, I don't know what building this is, but it's, you can see there's 12 men sitting idly at a table. They don't have shirts on, they have shorts on, they're barefoot, and they're essentially doing nothing but staring into space. Here are some children. This is building 29. This is from the New York Times. And it's, you can see that there are children who have constricted limbs, who are in carts. There's not much happening with them. These children, if they had been in the community, of course, should be in school. But they're just lying on these carts, and there are some children in the background in beds, a couple in wheelchairs. And this is from Geraldo's Exposé. It's a still shot of a young person in restraints. You can see that their feet are bound together and their hands are tied to their legs. They're not wearing clothes. They're wearing the kind of shift that was kind of a usual kind of uniform that people had. I'd be remiss if I didn't show you Bernard and Geraldo. As I said, Bernard was he's kind of the most famous resident of Willowbrook because he was such an articulate spokesperson for not only the people who resided there, but also later on for people with intellectual disabilities. So all of this kind of brought to the fore what was going on at this institution. And because of that, there was a lawsuit that was filed in March of 1972. So it's actually March 17th, so we're coming up on the anniversary. And the lawsuit was basically to try to get better care at Willowbrook. And it alleged that all of these things, that people got no evaluations. At Willowbrook, I think twice a year in order to keep the federal funding, people would estimate the IQs of the folks there. And that was in the record, but they never really did tests of people. There is failure to provide training for people, rehabilitation, no educational services, no services like speech therapy, clearly overcrowded, inadequate clothing and meals. People were confined to beds or chairs, as you saw, those people in carts. If they were working, there was a lack of compensation. They had no medical facilities, and understaffing and incompetence in the professional staff. People didn't know what to do. And if they had known what to do or how to help the people in those day rooms that you saw, they didn't have enough time to really teach people because they were busy making sure that people got to the bathroom or got fed. So the lawsuit, the original lawyer for Willowbrook was a man named Bruce Ennis. He was very famous in the mental health bar. He had sued a famous institution in Alabama the year before Willowbrook, Bryce State Hospital in Partlow, in a lawsuit called Wyatt versus Stickney. And in that lawsuit had some of the same conditions in Willowbrook. He had gotten an injunctive relief that essentially affirmed a right to treatment and a right to public education. But the judge in the Willowbrook case, Orrin Judd, wasn't persuaded of that. So in April, the injunction that he ordered for Willowbrook said that there was no right to treatment for those people in the institution, no right to an equal public education. But he did say that they had a right to protection from harm. And in fact, he said that they were entitled to the same living conditions as prisoners. By that point, people had been so outraged in New York and in the rest of the country at those pictures that Geraldo put on television that the plaintiffs decided they weren't going to accept that. So they went back to court and had a second trial that started in October of 1973. And although Bruce Ennis had been the original lawyer for Willowbrook, the people who really did the heavy lifting for the trial were these guys, Chris Hansen and Rob Levy. And they really looked like that. Chris Hansen never smiled and he always looked really, really worried. And Rob always looked really optimistic. Chris is now the lead attorney for the ACLU he's the senior staff attorney for the ACLU in DC, and Rob was a magistrate, federal magistrate for a long time, but he just retired. So at the second Willowbrook trial, the people who testified were professionals like Dr. Bronston and Elizabeth Lee, who had worked in Willowbrook and could talk about the conditions. some of the parents who were the named plaintiffs at Willowbrook, whose children had been there, and these brave parent advocates got up and talked about what it was like for their children. But they also had people who are experts who talked about the changes that could take place that would really help the people at Willowbrook. And one of the lead witnesses was a woman named Linda Glenn, who had worked with a man named Wolfensberger in Nebraska. And he had gotten this idea from Sweden about a new way of working with people with disabilities, particularly intellectual disabilities, that basically said that people in a situation like Willowbrook could only learn from each other, so that the behaviors and the kind of education they were getting was really self-referential to some extent, and that people had a right to human dignity, that they were human beings, and they had a right, like anyone else, to be out in the community with their peers, and they should have an evaluation that would allow people to learn the skills they need to live a life of dignity and purpose. So this theory was persuasive to the state and to the courts, and it was a theory called normalization. So that's the first innovation I'm going to talk about tonight. Here's Bengt Nierhe from Sweden, who was the person who, there are other antecedents to this in Scandinavia, but he was the one who came up originally articulating this principle. Wolfensberger then elaborated on it and talked about what it really meant and interpreted it in a way that could be operationalized for people at Willowbrook. So it doesn't mean that people with intellectual disabilities are going to be, made normal, but it does mean that they should be made, that the kinds of conditions that obtain in local society should be available to them. So they shouldn't be hidden away, and they should be given every opportunity to have a life as the same way that their peers have a life, and their quote non-disabled peers. So Wolfensberg, it's hard to overestimate the effect that Wolfensberger's work had on the field, because so much of what he articulated in this principle of normalization ended up in the Willowbrook consent judgment, which was a negotiation between the plaintiffs and the state of New York, signed by Governor Carey, who said that, he had been in the army and he had liberated a concentration camp when he was in the army, and those pictures of Willowbrook reminded him of that. And that was one of the reasons he committed the state to get people out of Willowbrook and to give them a life in the community. So some of the consent judgment really talked about improving conditions at Willowbrook, right? That the services had to be in the least restrictive environment, that language from the Rehab Act of 1973. People were entitled to clean bathroom facilities and working toilets. There wasn't toilet paper at Willowbrook. There weren't toothbrushes for people. They didn't have personal possessions. Some provisions to relieve overcrowding and so forth, right? Dental and medical care, nutrition. The people were entitled to 6 hours of education or other program activity on weekdays, like other children go to school and adults go to work, 2 hours of recreation a day in the community whenever possible, and that they should have individualized plans of care and periodic reviews of how their progress was coming along, staffing ratios that would allow for actually teaching skills to people, training for staff so they could learn how to teach those skills. And very importantly, these last two things: no resident would be presumed to be incapable of benefiting from education, and only 250 people were going to remain in Willowbrook by 1983. So the consent judgment essentially said 5,000 people are going to move into the community in 8 years. And that meant that an awful lot of people had to get involved to change the system. So an army of people came to help. Young people got involved, students who wanted to work to try and create community placements and to try to get people out of this institution. They were really called to the social justice portion of trying to help people. Siblings got involved, professionals, nurses, psychologists, social workers. Kathy Broderick, who was a beloved commissioner here, associate commissioner here in New York City, started as a special ed teacher at one of the state facilities. I know that there are nurses who worked at Willowbrook, like Fred Wetzel, who later went to do quality assurance. Some ended up working for the entity from the state that was charged with creating community placements. Some worked with parents to start new agencies or to grow existing ones. In those early days when these residences were being started, the idea was to try and create a family for people who didn't have one. It was quite clear at Willowbrook that that wasn't what was going on. So people used house parents, and so people volunteered to be house parents. And what that meant was that you lived 24/7 with the people in a community residence with these adults and children coming out of Willowbrook. And that was a model that was used for several years. People needed to create day programs so that if you were an adult and you were moving into the community, you had a place to go outside of the place where you lived, where you could learn skills or have some more education. People created recreation programs. And around the time of Willowbrook consent judgment, 1975, we got this the right to a public education for all children who were disabled. But those programs hadn't geared up yet, so that there were still some public schools that needed some support and some separate special ed programs that were developed. So I want to talk about the people who were at the Metropolitan Placement Unit, Barbara Blum, who was the first director of it, who was a heroine, and Jennifer House. When Willowbrook happened, there was a group of people that were appointed by the court to oversee the implementation of this complicated consent judgment that was going to create this community system. And Dr. House was the first executive director of the Willowbrook Review Panel. That was the panel that was overseeing this change into the community. But many other people signed on to work at the Metropolitan Placement Unit. And there are people who are still around today in New York, Donna Colonna, who started Services Fund for the Underserved, and Katie Meskel, who made the film Unforgotten, who used to work for an agency called HeartShare, and many, many others who worked for the NPU. Ed Matthews, who now is the head of what used to be UCP New York City, United Cerebral Palsy, is now called ADAPT Community Network, was charged with going out and working with communities when these residences were getting developed. And he took an awful lot of abuse from community meetings. And I'll talk more about that in a minute. So New York State is under pressure to develop these community programs. And they started to work with little nonprofits, the ones like the one that Ann Greenberg started, that got incorporated and was now asked to create residential programs for people coming out of Willowbrook. It was very important that people not get dumped in the community, as had happened to folks in the mental health system who had a psychiatric label. So every person in Willowbrook had to have a quality community placement, and that meant a place to live, a day program in place, and staffing that met the ratios that were outlined in the Willowbrook consent judgment, personal possessions, and other, and there were other provisions that they had to have, right? Medical care. The state systems to support the community system were slow to develop and slow to help. So that if Barbara Blum or Dr. House went out and created a contract with a little nonprofit to go find a house, renovate the house, find staff, train staff, and then welcome some residents from Willowbrook into that community, often what would happen is that they wouldn't pay for a really long time. So the organizations were left with very little money. And moreover, before Before the residents from Willowbrook moved in, there was no way to actually buy the house that these residents were going to live in. The initial funding was inadequate. And so Barbara Blum got more money from Albany to try to support this. But this was not Medicaid yet, right? We didn't have Medicaid in this system. These were called community residences, and they were funded with a whole different funding mechanism. So one of the things that happened was after Geraldo did his expose, people started sending him money. So he ended up with a lot of money he didn't know what much to do with. So he created a foundation that it did fundraising to support this move into the community and did public education to try and ease the way for people coming into the community from Willowbrook State School. And that's where I worked. There's a foundation called 1-to-1. We thought initially we would only have to do one or two things, so our official name is an extraordinary event. But there was a series of celebrities who came to help us. The last concert John Lennon ever did, he did for us. You could see it was on August 30th of 1972. And with the money we raised from that concert, I think we funded 5 or 6 community residences. Here's a kind of a fuzzy letter from Al Pacino to Geraldo in May of 1976 saying that he would like to come and, but he can't make the television show because he's got other projects and that he hopes he's going to read Geraldo's book pretty soon. I was cleaning out my closet 3 weeks ago and I found this letter. So as well as a very nice handwritten note from Max von Sydow and one from Evel Knievel. So we kind of ran the realm from the sublime to the ridiculous in terms of people who came to help us. But also Stevie Wonder came to help. He led one of our walkathons that we did. We did a lot of special events where we tried to get a lot of people involved in a way that was fun, unusual, non-threatening. We did dance marathons at the Copacabana. And then we did a bunch of concerts. It wasn't just John Lennon. I know Chicago did one for us as well. And there were a bunch of other people who helped raise money because they wanted to help people get out of Willowbrook. High school students and college students, and a group of people that you wouldn't think would be in the same, have the same interests. Veterans of foreign wars, the Elks Club. Some people came from Willowbrook and they moved into the West Village, into a facility that the state had. And the Gay Activists Alliance was really active in the West Village, and they would take the residents of that facility out on excursions in the community. And I remember going on a ferry boat ride with them and with some of these people who were in Wharton Street. The Teamsters Union raised money for us. Coyote, which was a prostitute self-help group, added money onto the money they were asking for their tricks, and they sent it to us. Wall Street brokers and back office clerks. Corporations gave us training rooms, so we did training in the conference room at Electro Records and Sears Roebuck, McGraw-Hill, JP Morgan Chase, and Citicorp gave us training rooms. The investigative reporters, not just Geraldo, but others, kept the pressure on, and they kept going back and doing reports about what had happened. And that was really helpful to keep the pressure on the state of New York to live up to the agreement that they had made. And President and Mrs. Carter, oddly enough, when President Carter was running for president, he came to the 1-to-1 office because he wanted to learn how to do rock concerts that would support his presidential campaign. And so we taught him how to do that. And I think we got the Allman Brothers to help him, and that kept his campaign alive. So he was grateful. And when he and Mrs. Carter became president, she did some public service spots for us, but also she was very concerned about the stigma attached to people with disabilities in the community. And she created a task force on media and public attitudes to try and figure out how the media could be helpful in changing attitudes about people with a psychiatric label or a mental or an intellectual disabilities label. So we were represented on that. My boss at 1-to-1, Paul Dolan, went there, but also Norman Lear was on that task force and people from Sesame Street. And the idea was to try to get more people with disabilities on kind of mainstream television. And that was really important because one of the things that happened when we started to move into the community was that the houses that we funded got burnt down by the neighbors, which may be shocking to you. There were bomb threats, vandalism, violence. And the article that Bob Keating was writing about was a group home that we had funded in Long Island and Huntington. And I remember I actually got the call from the people to tell me that it had burnt down. On a cold winter night, the neighbors had told the house parents, asked them, called up, pretended to be the fire department, asked them if they were going to be home. And, you know, they said they were going to go to the movies, and they told them to please leave the chimney flue open. And they bombed the house and killed the residents, the house parents' dog. At that point, the people who were supposed to live there hadn't moved in yet. But that wasn't unusual in those days. I think there were several houses that were bombed or burnt down. People got threats all the time from the community. So it was not an easy move into the community. And I know that Barbara Blum, from the Metropolitan Placement Unit, was a very genteel lady, got her nose broken in one of kind of a violent community meeting one night. She got pelted with rotten eggs. And because we were the funding source for some of these programs, we got to go to those community meetings as well. So I remember going to some and having the neighbors steal, you know, our lights and say really horrible things. Anyway, the good news was that things started to move along. And I wanted to talk about the people who really helped the system that you really don't know about. And that's the second thing. And I'm going to move quickly now because I know I've been talking a while. If you don't know about Tom Gilhole, you should. Tom was the son of coal miners, and he worked for public interest law in Pennsylvania. He was the first person to sue for the education for children, the right to the education for children with disabilities. And he won in 1972. And he was the first person. So for a while, Pennsylvania was the only state in which children had the right to go to school. He was also a lawyer for the Pennhurst case. And because that right existed in Pennsylvania, here's John Bradamus, who basically sponsored HR 70, the Education for All Handicapped Children Act, PL 94-142, which was passed in 74, took effect in 75, right around the time of the consent decree, and later became IDEA. And once the IDEA was passed, people got the right to early intervention services and the right to special ed preschool. So he was a hero. And co-sponsors of the bill were Mayor Ed Koch from New York City, Shirley Chisholm, and Herman Badillo from the Bronx. So I wanted to mention that because this is about New York. If you don't know about Mark Gold, you should. Mark Gold was a special ed teacher from California. And for a while, he would go into the institutional system and try to work with the people who had kind of the least expectation that they would be able to learn. He had this system called Try Another Way, and he would, with these folks that everybody thought were kind of uneducable, he would get them to assemble this 37-part bicycle brake. And one of the things that he did in the videos that he made and the work that he did was show that many people had just written off as being unable to learn and unable to have skills, actually could do a lot. He changed the way people thought about people who had this label of severe disability or profound disability, intellectual disability. He died too young, but he was really innovative at the time. Valerie Schaaf, who started People First in 1974, was the originator of the self-advocacy movement. If you don't know about Valerie, she was from Oregon. Those ideas came from west to east. Up until this time, this was essentially a parent-led movement. It wasn't anticipated that people with intellectual disabilities could articulate what they wanted, and they were often not present at meetings about themselves. So typically, if you were planning services for somebody with an intellectual disability, they wouldn't be at the table. There would be professionals there, social workers and psychologists or special ed teachers, but the person for whom you were planning was not present. So she started a revolution in the way we thought about people with intellectual disabilities being able to articulate what they wanted and having them be present when plans were made with them instead of for them. Mark Friedman and Ruth Marie Beckwith, who are two of our instructors, were really instrumental in developing self-advocacy in the United States. So I wanted to acknowledge them as well. Tom Nerney, you may not know about Tom Nerney, but if you have in-home community rehabilitation services or respite, or your family member is living in a small residential unit that's less than a few people, you have Tom Nerney to thank. Tom got 100 of his friends to give him $1,000 back in the early 1980s, and he moved into this little apartment in Washington, D.C., a little dark, cheap apartment, and he lobbied to get the home and community-based waiver passed. So many states had those services as of 1983. New York didn't get the waiver until 1993, but we now have a system of more flexible supports. Up until that time, if you had a child living at home and your family started to have real problems, or if you had kept your adult family member at home and you were now in your 80s and you would have to give your child up to one of these community residences. We didn't have in-home services, but now we do because of Tom. And he also originated this idea of self-determination, which is now a program in New York State, where the money follows the person with a disability instead of paying it to an agency to support that person in the way the agency determines. So you can thank Tom. He unfortunately died a couple of years ago, but he was just an inspirational thinker in the field. Here's Beth Bounds, who originated person-centered planning, which is now something that's required here in New York State. And it was another new way of thinking, along with her colleagues, John O'Brien and Connie O'Brien, Marcia Forrest and Michael Small. But it was really Beth who developed this system of, instead of looking at a person with an intellectual disability and determining what skills they needed, the system really looks at a whole person and asks them what their hopes and dreams are for themselves. What do they want out of life? And looks for natural supports, not just professional supports, but people who are in their lives that might help them achieve that dream. And in New York State now, every person who enters the system has a person-centered plan that looks at their needs, but also their goals and their hopes, and really sets them in the center of the services rather than having a team of professionals decide what's best for them. That was a revolution in thinking. It was considered outlandish as well as self-advocacy. So I want to thank Beth for her work. Dustin Dart, as well as the folks who were in the Capitol crawl, were the ones who helped get the ADA passed. And he was a remarkable person, friend of the president, President Bush, and really pushed for the passage of the ADA. But I think that the people who flung themselves out of wheelchairs and crawled up the steps of the Capitol and occupied the building also have a lot to do with it in 1990. Without him, we wouldn't have the ADA. And last, people who sued for Olmsted, Elaine Wilson and Lois Curtis, for young women who are living in an institution in Atlanta and sued under the ADA for their ability to live in the community. They're represented by the Atlanta Legal Aid Society, and Ruth Bader Ginsberg, our heroine, wrote the Olmsted opinion, saying that essentially that was a form of segregation, and if people wanted to move into the community, she reaffirmed their right to do so. So that was a really important innovation as well. So here we are in New York State now, and we have this amazing service system where 121,000 people receive services in New York State now. 38,000 receive residential services, mostly in small places. There's 212 people still left in developmental centers, or what we call institutional care. About 95% of the people receive Medicaid. But we now have early intervention and preschool programs, inclusive education in school, care coordination that uses person-centered planning to help people. We have in-home supports, smaller residential programs, people living in apartments, shared housing. We have the ability to support people in their house. So if they're an aging person and their parents are no longer with them, we can keep them in their home. There's this idea of self-determination where people can have a budget and buy the services that they would like to have rather than having it determined by an agency. We have support for families and recreation programs. We have employment options and the emphasis on paid employment. We have techniques to teach a wide variety of skills, including making choices for people so that they can tell people what they want. Self-advocates are important advisors to service providers. So this outlandish idea that people with intellectual disabilities can speak for themselves is now a mainstream idea, and people are being incorporated into the boards of directors of nonprofits, but also are the center of their own plans. And we have inclusion on college campuses, programs in Think College, and also here at CUNY Unlimited, which my colleague Carrie Shockley is sponsoring. So things are better. Willowbrook closed in 1987, although there were still people living in institutions in New York State because some of them moved. But are moving out. I think that most of the institutions are closed now, and people are living in the community. And when I was at the closing ceremony, the discharge of the case in the Judge Orrin Judge died. He was the original Willowbrook judge. Judge Bartels took over. And when I was in the closing ceremony in Judge Bartels' chambers in 1983, when they formally got a permanent injunction, but basically discharged the case, so many people who had been in Willowbrook talked, and they had apartments and lives. They were married. Some had children, and they really were having good lives, the kinds of lives that we envisioned for people when so many of us were called to help back in 1972 to help. So it was to some extent a successful revolution. I wanted to just these are some of the people that were my family I worked with. On the left is my boss, Paul Dolan from 1 to 1, and my husband, Duncan Whiteside, who was one of the original Willowbrook parents. That's me with short hair and more wrinkles. And Bernard Carabello, this was at one of his birthday parties, and you can see Bernard is looking happy these days that he got out. But I don't want to say that things are perfect. We have continued workforce issues. I've been hearing about problems with the workforce in terms of vacancies and people needing more skills since 1975, and we still have the same issues. There are still issues of access to services that new parents need help. We still need to educate professionals. My stepson Michael, who I told you about earlier, is actually in the hospital right now, and I was visiting him in the intensive care unit on Saturday, and his doctor, who was very nice, came up and asked me if he had Down syndrome, which of course he doesn't. And it was surprised me that he would ask, because it's pretty clear that he doesn't have Down syndrome. So I still think that we need education of professionals of all kinds about all disabilities, and it's a really broad and complex subject. We still have funding cuts and programs closures. I keep hearing that early intervention programs are closing because the fees that agencies are getting aren't enough to support them. So these things are all still problematic. We have a continual need to educate new parents. I forget that children with disabilities are being born every day, and parents don't come into the world, with this knowledge about how to care for them. Our systems rely on informed advocacy from families consistently, both the educational system. If you have a child in school now, you know what I mean, a child with a disability. We're in this medical model because when New York State was under such pressure to get people out of institutions, and the funding that they had was inadequate, they went very heavily into Medicaid. And therefore, the system is a medical model that we've got, and we need to rethink it. And we need those outlier ideas and new energy that were happening every decade or so back, starting at Willowbrook. I think that that's the time for it. For further reading, if you're interested, you can read Geraldo's book, which I have a copy of in my office. Rothman and Rothman, The Willowbrook Wars, David Good's History and Sociology of Willowbrook State School, Ruthie Marie Beckwith's Disability Servitude, Paul Castellani's Snake Pit Cash Cows, James Trent, Inventing the Feeble Mind, which is a really wonderful book about the building of institutions in New York. One of our graduates, Alan Goldstein, wrote a book about his life with his brother, who was in Willowbrook. And I told Bill Brunson I would give a plug for his book when I talked to him a few weeks ago. So here is his new book, Public Hostage, Public Ransom, and Institutional America. And Bill said when I talked to him that he had some ideas for how to fund things differently so that we got away from this medical model. I'm through. I know I went over, but we still will have questions if people would like to ask them.
Oh, thank you so much, Mariette. That was
I apologize for rambling.
You did a great job, as always. And we have so many comments and questions. We're at 7:03, and we've been told by our organizers that we can go a little bit over. So the people that have submitted questions, I'll be sharing some of those. We may not get to all of them because we have to end at 7:15. So we just have about 11 minutes for questions. But, I want to say in summary, as a retrospective, you've shown so well how we've gone from exclusion, elimination, and containment of people to really liberation and, like you said, human dignity. And I love what you said about that starting place of coming from a place of assuming that everyone has the ability to be educated and should be, right? So with that, I'm just going to give you a couple of the questions that came in, and I have condensed a couple. Some were similar. One is a comment, and then I'm going to go on to questions. Don Johnson, I don't know where he's from, but he said he remembers.
Hi, Don.
Don. He said
I do.
He remembers an arson attempt at Catholic Charities in Huntington Station as well. And he noted how someone had disconnected an exhaust connection from the furnace to focus the heat in the beams of the basement.
Yep.
So disturbing, and just, it's so important though, like you said, to remember in retrospect where we've come from. Samantha Cooperberg asked, where was the funding from Willowbrook coming from? What was the initial motivation for setting it up? Were there monetary incentives?
Funding came from what used to be called the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare. It's now called, it's Medicaid money. It was Medicaid money then. And actually, in Paul Castellani's book, From Snake Pits to Cash Cows, there's a whole explication of the funding and why these institutions were maintained by the state. So there weren't, you know, I have to say that people wanted this kind of care, that people didn't understand. You know, I remember Diana McCourt, who was one of the parents, and I think her daughter was a named plaintiff in the Willowbrook case, saying to me that it wasn't until the Willowbrook trial that she understood that there was a different way to take care of people. The parents were so brainwashed that this was the thing to do, that people were going to be safe because of these brick buildings, and that these people there were experts. And then even though they could see that that wasn't true, because when they saw their children, they knew that they weren't getting better, they couldn't kind of put it together in any way. So, you know, so people were kind of convinced that this was the way to go until there was this revolution in thinking.
Right, right. Thank you. From another question was, how do you think residents now are doing as a whole? Are there any services for ongoing psychological treatment for the trauma that they endured that you know of?
Yeah, I mean, people get pretty good care. I mean, I have to say they get good care. That if they do see psychologists or psychiatrists when they need to. But having said that, I also think our system's in a rut. When I said that that systems tend toward entropy over time. Some of the community residences that we created, you know, with the best of intentions, and from people coming from Willowbrook as well as the other institutions, are quite institutional. You know, they're like mini institutions, and that depends, and so much of that depends on the person running the house, the agency that operates it. In some cases, there are residences that are operated by New York State, and in those cases, it's very hard to fire people who do bad things. So, so there's a kind of institutional thinking still. So I think we're headed in the right direction, but I don't think we're there yet. And I think part of it has to do with the funding that supports these programs.
Yeah, and on that note, Riley Spreadbury asked, was President Carter only interested in learning about cooler fundraising ideas, or did he also express interest in helping in your effort toward deinstitutionalization?
Well, you know, I think he was distracted.
Maybe.
But they did, you know, they did what they could. I think Rosalind Carter in particular was interested in mental health. So she was the one, as her, you know, first ladies always have a project, right? And her project was mental health, which is why she originated the Task Force on Media and Public Attitudes. I think that they weren't particularly interested in getting involved in the whole deinstitutionalization movement, but they were interested in trying to create situations where communities were more welcoming of the people coming out of the institutions, and so they were kind of laying the groundwork for that. So I think that they were helping in their own way.
Yeah, thank you. We have a question from Sugandha Gupta. She said, I'm sorry, they said, I'm not sure of your gender. They're a person who has vision impairment, has seen some of the amazing facilities offered by New York State to people with disabilities, but has also witnessed many negative experiences. One question they have is, how are some of the ways in which people with disabilities, how can they voice their needs to the state and help with that continued evolution of the mindset to get away from that which is still rooted in dependency or rescue?
I think that You know, I think the Self-Advocacy Association of New York State is very helpful in that regard. You know, it was started by Bernard Carabello. It actually started in my office at Maidstone. But it's, you know, a statewide organization. They have chapters. And that is a way to, they do have the ear of the commissioner, and it's a way to continue to voice your concern. But also, if I remember correctly, the office of, it's now called OPWDD, has hearings periodically, and people can register and testify at those hearings and talk directly to the people from the state. So I would go on their website and do that.
Yeah, right. Also, Deva Kasnitz wanted a plug for Bronston's book as well. That's in the chat. We have that and all of the other resources that you mentioned.
Bill will be happy.
Yes, I think we have time for one more question, and it's related to something that I wanted to say in closing remarks too, which is you've done this work, you've set this legacy, but it's also to continue on with the programs that you created at SPS. You know, a lot of people ask on the Geraldo program we were on a few weeks ago, well, what can we do? And I know because of the work you've done and other disability studies scholars and self-advocates, that will continue that thought of how can we do better? How can we think about how society disables people and how can we move from a medical model? So all of this is a segue into the last question, which was from Brenda Brueggerman, and she asks, were the connections between Willowbrook and any colleges and institutions of higher education?
I think that there were people from those colleges that got involved as professionals, you know, and then and with the City University, the work that Bill Ebenstein did with John F. Kennedy Jr. To try and support the frontline workforce was really, really important. You know, we started to create courses about disability back in 1990, really. I taught in one that was specifically for to help people working with folks with developmental disabilities at City College, and then that kind of moved into our disability studies program. So it's kind of been an evolution. But there was a lot of back and forth, and one of the things that John F. Kennedy did at CUNY was to create reaching, you know, through Reaching Up, and the Institute for the John F. Kennedy Jr. Institute for Worker Ed, the Kennedy Fellows Program, which supported people going to college who were working in the field to try to deepen their understanding and their learning. And that, as I said, kind of segued over time into our disability studies program, but it still has the same spirit, I like to think.
Thank you so very much, Mariette. And thank you to everyone who is here. We are going to have our next event, the second part in this Willowbrook retrospective series, April 12th. And then we also will have another event, April 27th, which is, you get to have a sneak peek with authors from the Journal for Teaching Disability Studies. That's toward the end of April. Thank you, everyone, so much. Thank you, Mariette. And Mark.
I wanted to give a plug for Clarence Sundrum because he's a superstar.
Oh, yes.
So
that's April 12th.
Come to his event, you should.
We hope to see you all there. Have a fabulous night.